Alright, in this lecture, we're going to be creating a new prop, which is going to be a potion book. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a top surface for our book and also add some texture to it. So I have a 1000 by 1000 pixel document here. I've filled the background in with this mid-tone gray. I'll show you the color right now. So here's the color right there. There's its color number. And then I've added a new layer above that, which is where I'm going to be creating my book. So first, I'm going to use my marquee tool, and I'm going to select out a rectangular shape like so. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab a dark purplish, almost burgundy color. So maybe somewhere in there, maybe a little bit darker. Then go ahead, and actually, I think I'm going to make that just a tiny bit lighter. Go ahead and hit OK, and then I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. Next, I'm going to go ahead and create a new layer above this. Then holding down Alt or Option if you're on a Mac, you're going to go ahead and hover between these two until you get this arrow pointing down at your other layer with a box next to it. Once you get that, you can go ahead and click between the two of them, and that will automatically create a clipping layer mask for this layer. So this is a much quicker way to create a clipping layer mask. Then let's go ahead and use our brush tool. And I'm going to be using this brush right here. So this is just a generic brush that you can find here in Photoshop. It's down here towards the bottom, and it has the number 100 underneath it. And all it is it's just a bunch of little spots. If we go ahead and space these out, you'll see it's just a bunch of little dots all together. But we want to keep that together so it's a nice brush. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring up my brush size a little bit. And then I want to go ahead and select a darker version of this. So maybe come down to there and maybe more into my purples, hit OK, and then I'm going to bring my brush opacity down to 20% by hitting the number 2 on my keyboard, and now I'm going to begin painting in a little bit more texture onto my book. Now I want the edges of my book to be darker than anywhere else, so that's why I'm painting mostly on these edges, and I'm just adding in some random marks in there. Now don't worry if this doesn't look perfect, we can always go back and erase, or we can even go back and paint over it, which is what we're going to be doing in this case. So once we got some marks in there, next what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and switch over to a lighter color. So I'm going to come up to about there, maybe a little bit more saturated. And then I'm going to come down into more of my orange colors. So maybe about there, hit OK. And then I'm going to start painting with this. And I'm still painting at 20% opacity. And I'm just going to paint right across the top like so. And I just want to keep this very organic looking. And then I might switch back over to this darker purple color by selecting it with my eyedropper, and then I'll begin painting with that over the top of this until I get this looking just the way I want. We can also grab a few other colors, so we can go ahead and grab, let's say, a brown. So I'm going to come into my dark browns. I'll paint a little bit with that. We can also go ahead and grab a blue just to add some more color in there. I'm going to bring it up to somewhere in here, hit OK. I'll go ahead and add a few marks with this. And I'm going to bring my brush opacity down to 10% now, so it's even lighter. We can also grab some reds, so I'll come all the way up into my reds. I'll paint a little bit of some red in there, just to give our book cover a little bit more color and more depth. Sometimes you don't realize it, but in really good art, you'll find that there are a lot of different colors in there. Then I'm going to go ahead and select this color right there that we originally had for a highlight, and I'm just going to paint over all of this once again, just to sort of bring it all together. And I might add a few layers of this and just go scribble across it. Great. We can also go in here and find maybe another brush, space it out, and just add a little bit more of a different texture. So I'm going to bring my brush size up, and then I'll go ahead and switch over to, let's say, a dark grayish brown color, so maybe in there, hit OK, and then I'm going to add in just a few spots here. And I'm going to bring my brush opacity up to 20%, and then I'll just add in a few texture spots with this brush. Now I'm noticing that it's a little bit darker up here at this top side, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this lighter color here, and I'm just going to paint in this top side just a little bit more. Alright, perfect. I think that looks pretty good for our texture. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and merge our clipping layer mask and our shape layer together, so that's all one layer. Then I'm going to go ahead and use my transform tool by hitting Control T or Command T if you're on a Mac. And what I want to do is I want to put this plane or the surface into perspective. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to come to distort. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this middle guy right here at the bottom. And now if I drag that, you'll see it'll drag my two edge points out here with it. So I'm going to drag this so we can sort of slant our image over and also squash it a little bit. So maybe to right about there. And we can bring this guy down maybe a little bit. All right, perfect. But now we don't just want to have perspective going in this direction. We want to also get a little bit of perspective on our horizontal axis also. So I'm going to go ahead and grab this corner right here and I'm going to bring it down to about there. And then I want to grab this corner and bring this up to about there. And I want to try to get the same angle on the top as I have on the bottom. So this angle and this angle should be matching. Then I'll go ahead and hit enter. And now we have the top surface of our book. Next, we want to go ahead and create the bottom surface of our book. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control J or Command J if you're on a Mac. And now we have a copy of that. So I'm actually going to bring this bottom layer down. So I'll bring that down to right about there. And we can bring it straight down, but since this is in a perspective on our X and Y axis, we need to go ahead and nudge this over a little bit so that these lines right here are also going to be at a horizontal angle. Next, we need to go ahead and create the spine for our book. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of this bottom layer, and then I'm going to go ahead and use my lasso tool, and I'm just going to cut right through the middle of it, maybe even a little past the middle, and I'll go ahead and delete all of that out here. You can't tell that it's deleted, but if I go ahead and move that layer, you'll see that I deleted all that. Then I'm going to go ahead and turn on my transform tool, and then I'm going to right click, come to warp, and what I want to do is I want to warp this up so this matches up here to that corner, and then I want to warp this side up so it matches to that corner also. But I want to make sure that it's also touching down here at this bottom corner, so right about there. Alright, great. I think that should work perfect. So now we're going to go ahead and hit enter. And then what we want to do is we want to go ahead and use our lasso tool. I'm going to switch over to my polygonal lasso tool. And I'm going to click from this corner all the way into here and then all the way down to there. And then connect it back so I can delete everything that's underneath this front cover of the book. So I'll hit delete. And then I want to go ahead and delete a straight line coming all the way across here, like so, just so that we can get this line a bit straighter. And then using my erase tool, and I want to make sure I'm on a hard-edged brush, I'm going to go ahead and erase away a little bit more of a curve into the spine of the book right there. So now that's curved just a little bit more. So now we have the basic parts of our book cover. But what we need to do now is we need to add a little bit of some shadowing in there to make this look a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to first off start with the bottom book cover. Then I'm going to hit Control U or Command U if you're on a Mac. And now we can go ahead and darken that a little bit because since it's on the bottom, it's going to be getting a little bit more shadow. And then we can bring the saturation up just a tiny bit. The darker things get, the more saturated they tend to become. So then we'll go ahead and hit OK. Then we want to do the same thing for the spine because we're going to say that the light source is coming from over here. So it's going to be hitting this top surface and the side surfaces over here that you can't see. So that means this surface over here on the spine is going to be a shadow surface. So once again, we'll hit Control U or Command U if you're on a Mac. We're going to go ahead and darken that, and I'm going to darken it a little bit darker than our bottom book cover. So right about there should be good. And then I'm going to bring up the saturation just a tiny bit, hit OK, and then we're going to go ahead and merge our spine layer and our top surface layer together. So that's all going to be one layer. Now we don't want to merge this to this bottom layer because we're going to add some pages in here between the front and the back cover. And if those are merged together, we're not going to be able to insert them underneath this front cover. Next, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in here just a little bit. And then I'm going to select my dark color on this spine and then using my brush tool. And I'm going to bring down the brush size. And if you'd like, you can stay on this textured brush. You can use whatever brush you'd like. I'm going to paint right along this edge. And I'm going to start blending in this edge to the top surface of my book. So once it's blended to about this point, I'm going to go ahead and select this top book cover. And I'll go ahead and blend into the spine. Then once I have that blended in, I'm going to go ahead and select this mid color that we have here. And then I'm going to switch over to a different brush. I think I can grab a different brush that will do a better job of this. So I'm going to use this paintbrush tool right here. And also remember that we're painting at 20% opacity when we're doing this. And I'm just going to paint right along this edge. And that just helps it blend in so it's not such a hard edge between the top surface and the back of the spine. Alright, now lastly what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and shape the shape of our book cover a little bit more. So using my erase tool, and I'm going to switch over to this paintbrush tool for my eraser. And what I want to do is just erase away some of these areas like the corners so they're not such hard edges or sharp corners. And then I'm also going to break up the lines of the edges of my book just a little bit so it looks a little bit older, more tattered and beat. Do the same thing up here on the top. We can even add in maybe just a tiny little notch going in there. We also want to do the same thing down here on the bottom and maybe even shape out the spine a little bit more so it's not such a straight line. Then we'll go ahead and switch down to the bottom book cover. And we'll do the same thing. So I'm going to erase away this corner a little bit, add a little bit more shape in there. Alright, perfect. I think that should work great. So now we have the basic setup for our book. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and create the book pages that go between our two covers. I really hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to create the book pages that go between our book covers. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and add a new layer above all of our other layers. Then using my rectangular marquee tool, I'm going to select a rectangle out just like this. Then I'm going to go ahead and select a color. So I'm going to grab this color but make it a little bit lighter so it's sort of a yellowish, maybe actually come down more into the yellows. So there's my color number right there. Hit OK, and then I'm going to go ahead and fill this shape in. Next, I want to go ahead and grab a darker version of this color and come up into my greens so it's a little bit more of a cool color for my shadows. Hit OK. Then using my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and making sure that I still have my rectangular selected so I can't paint outside of it. I'm going to paint some lines through here that are going to be my book pages. So I'm going to click up here, hold down Shift, and then I can paint a straight line all the way through. So again, you want to click, then you can paint a line all the way through. Now, if you don't click again, what will happen is if you come back up to here and then you hold down Shift and paint again, it's going to paint that line all the way across there. So you want to make sure that you click once before you do that. Or another way of getting around this is if you paint down to here, well then you don't have to click again, you can just click here and then paint across here because it'll connect these two lines together, except you can't see it because it's off of your document. So as long as you're zigzagging back and forth from top to bottom, you should be fine. Now, these don't have to be perfectly spaced out. It's actually better if they're not perfectly spaced out. Next, let's go ahead and grab an even darker color, and we're going to come down into our oranges, maybe make this a little bit more saturated, hit OK. I'm using my brush tool, and I'm going to bring my brush size up just a little bit, and I'm going to paint at 30% opacity. I'm going to go ahead and paint along the edges of some of these lines in here. I'm going to bring that brush size up just a little bit more. So I want to paint along the edge just like that. And this is just going to be creating a little bit of a cast shadow from some of these groups of pages, because in between each one of these lines, there's more than just one page. It's just that these are kind of the groups of all the pages. If you've ever looked at a book, you'll notice that they're sort of grouped together and then stapled together and then sewn into the spine. So that's basically what each one of these are, and we want to create a little bit more of a realistic look by adding some shadow in there. Next, let's go ahead and select our original book page color, and then we're going to grab an even lighter version of that, so maybe about there, come a little bit more towards our yellows, so it's a little bit more saturated, and we actually might make it a little bit lighter than that. So about there should be good. Then we'll go ahead and paint, and I'm still painting at 30% opacity. I'm going to go ahead and paint some lines across here for highlights. And we can also go in there and hand paint in a few little lines on top of here and start layering in on that opacity. That way we just get a little bit more texture in these book covers. Maybe the edges of these books are tattered or they're ripped, and so we might be getting a little bit more texture in there. All right, perfect. So now we have all of our book pages. What we want to do now is we want to go ahead and use the transform tool on this layer. And we're going to go ahead and first off shrink it down a little bit, so maybe to about there. It'll probably get shrunk down more, but for now that should be good. Then we're going to go ahead and rotate this, and we want to rotate it to a 90-degree angle, and you can do that by holding down Shift and rotating until it looks about straight, and it'll click right into place. Then we want to go ahead and drag this down to about here. We're going to go ahead and shrink that down a tiny bit more, so it's about the size of our book. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit Enter. So now that we have about the size and the placement of where we want this, I'm going to go ahead and drag this underneath this layer. So now I can actually place it in there. So then turning my transform tool back on, right clicking and coming to distort, we're going to go ahead and move these corners to the correct position until we get this looking the way we want it. So I'm going to move that to about there, move this out to here, and move this one out to here. I think something like that should look good. We'll go ahead and hit Enter. Great. So now we have those book pages in there. I can also go ahead and use my lasso tool to cut off a little bit of this edge over here because the line isn't necessarily straight. It's a little bit wider over here than it is over here. So I'll go ahead and hit Delete. And I think that works much better. Now, also what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add in a little bit more of a textured edge on the edge of our book pages so it looks more realistic. So using my eraser tool, I'm going to go ahead and just start erasing out some lines like this. And that just starts to add in a little bit more of some shape on the edge of those pages. And in fact, what you can do is you can even curve this in a little bit, because you'll see a lot of the times if you look at reference that books actually curve in on the pages. I think it has something to do with the binding, I'm not sure, but I think it makes our book look more interesting. Then we can go ahead and re-erase in all of those little shapes so that each page looks like an individual page. All right, great. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. Awesome. I think that looks pretty dang good. Now, lastly, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add a shadow on these pages being cast from the top cover. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to switch up to my top cover layer. I'm also noticing that this got messed up a little bit when we erased it. So what I'm going to do is just select this color here, and I'm just going to brush in a little bit more of a shape in there to help that out. And then I'm going to come back to creating my shadow. So the way we're going to create our shadow is by holding down Control or Command if you're on a Mac. Select the shape of your top book cover by clicking the thumbnail. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer underneath my book cover layer, but above my pages layer. Then using the color black, I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. And since it's underneath our book cover, you can't see it yet. But once I use my grab and move tool and use the arrow keys on my keyboard to nudge this down, I'm going to nudge it down to about there. Now you can see our shadow. Next, what we need to do is we need to go ahead and cut off these edges that aren't above our book pages. So I'm going to go ahead and select my book page shape, and then I'm going to go ahead and hit Control-Shift-I to invert the selection, and then hit Delete to delete away all of those edges that we don't want. So now we have a nice shadow in there on our book pages. And lastly, what I want to do is I'm going to bring down the opacity, and I'm going to bring it down to about 95%. Then using my erase tool, and I'm going to switch over to a soft edged brush to do this. I'm going to go ahead and erase away these edges at 20% opacity. So I'm just going to erase right along this bottom edge just to soften that a little bit so it's not such a hard edge. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. I think it looks pretty dang good. That brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, we went ahead and we created the pages for our book as well as a cast shadow from the top surface of our book. In the next lecture, we're going to go ahead and create some ornate ironwork for our book, as well as a gem that's going to go on the top surface. I really hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one. In this lecture, we're going to go ahead and create some really cool ornate ironwork on our book. So we're going to create sort of some latches over here on our binding, and we're going to add a gem into the center. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, I'm going to add a new layer above all of my layers, and on this layer, I'm going to paint in the shape for one of my latches. Now, I want to start off with a pretty dark gray color, so I'm thinking somewhere right about there. I'll hit OK, then using my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and just start painting in the shape of my latch. Now I'm going to bring my brush size down quite a bit, and I'm just going to start painting in the shape of my latches. So I want to create a curved line right along the spine, just like this. And these don't have to be perfect because these have been banged out of iron by a blacksmith, and so there's going to be some imperfections in it. So then I'm going to come across over to here to about that distance, and then I'm going to add another curved line over here. So there's part of our latch on the spine of our book. Now we want to do the latch on the top surface, so I'm going to create two lines that are coming in towards each other, like this, and then I want to have the line that connects these two together. That needs to be at the same angle as this line, and all the lines that are going in that direction on our book. So we don't want these to be straight like this. We want to make sure that this line ends a little bit sooner than this one. And then we're going to go ahead and add in a little bit more detail in here. So I'm going to add in one circle right here, and then I'll add in a second circle right here. And just the same, we want these circles to connect at this diagonal line and not at a straight up and down line. And then lastly, I'm going to go ahead and add in a third circle right here, and I'm going to go ahead and add in a little bit of a point to that circle. Now I'm going to go ahead and fill this all in, and then we can go ahead and start adding in more detail to make this look more realistic. Once you have your shape completely filled in, you can go in there with your erase tool, and you can go ahead and erase away some of the areas that you don't want to help shape your shape out a little bit more. So for example, I might make that edge a little bit harder. I'm going to make sure I'm on a hard edged brush when I do this because I don't want a soft edge on these erased lines. Alright, great. Next, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add some shadow to this, because even though it's metal, there's still going to be some shadow. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer above this, create a clipping layer mask by holding down Alt or Option, hovering between the two, and then clicking. And then I'm going to go ahead and select a black color, and then putting my brush at 20% opacity, I'm going to go ahead and start painting in my shadow. So I'm just going to slowly layer this up until I get it looking the way I want it. So I'm going to add another layer now, and I might come a little bit further back than my last layer so I get a nice soft edge between my lighter color and my darker color. And then I might add a little bit more shadow down here at the bottom. Then I'm going to bring my brush opacity down to 20%. So that it's even softer now. I'm just going to soften all of these together. Alright, great. Next, what I want to do is I want to add a shadow edge along the bottom edge of my shape. So using my brush tool once again, and bringing my brush opacity up to 30%, I'm going to go ahead and just paint right along this bottom edge, just so it looks a little bit more three-dimensional because it has that nice shadow edge now. Great. Let's go ahead and zoom out, see how that looks. Awesome. Next, what I want to do is I'm noticing that it's a little bit darker here in the middle, so what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and select this dark gray color right here. Then using my brush tool and coming up to 100% opacity, I'm going to go ahead and paint right over the top of that to help blend that in just a little bit more. Great. Now we can go ahead and start adding in some of our ornate detail. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new layer, turn that layer into a clipping layer mask, and this is the layer I'm going to paint all of that detail on. So what I want to do is I first want to grab this light gray color right here, and then I'm going to use my brush tool, and I'm going to paint in some design on this part right here, and then when we get up to here, we're going to switch to a lighter gray. So bringing my brush size down, because since this is at an angle, all of the design here is going to be pretty squished. So it's going to come up like this, and I'm just going to start painting in almost some random shapes in here. Now, obviously you want them to have some good design, but I don't really have any of this planned out. If you wanted to, you could paint this out flat and then warp it with the transform tool so it fit onto the perspective of this part. But in this case, I'm just going to paint it on by hand because I think it'll look better that way and it'll be much quicker. So we can go ahead and add in some things like some swirls. So we might have a swirl come down like this and another one here. We might have some more up here. And we might have a dot there, maybe some lines. We want to do the same thing on the other side so it's symmetrical. All right, great. Now let's go ahead and move up to this top part. So I'm going to go ahead and select a lighter version of this color. So somewhere about there should do. We'll hit OK. And we're going to go ahead and continue this ornate design across here. So we're going to come all the way up into here. In this area, we're going to get sort of a clover type of design. And you'll notice that my design isn't perfect. It's not completely symmetrical. It's not completely perfect. And the reason for that is because this is handcrafted by a blacksmith, and so it's not going to look perfect. So it's all right if it's not. You want it to look handmade. At least I do. So that's why I'm okay with it looking this way. I'm going to go ahead and add some circles in on these edges. I'm going to go ahead and paint around these edges. Oops, we don't want to go over that shadow edge, so we want to make sure that we stay right along those edges. I'll add in some circles in here also, and we'll even add in sort of some flower designs within each one of these petals. Then I'm going to go ahead and add in some circles on this part, and maybe add in a circle in here. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. Alright, great. So now we have our design, but it's not really looking like metal. The reason for this is because it doesn't really have any highlights or reflections on it. So let's go ahead and add some of those in right now. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down Control or Command if you're on a Mac, and I'm going to select the shape of everything on that layer. Then I'm going to go ahead and zoom in there, and starting with this lighter gray, I'm going to grab an even lighter gray. So I'm going to grab a gray that's right about there, maybe even brighter than that, and we'll paint at a lower opacity so we can layer up the reflection. Using my brush tool and bringing up the brush size to quite a large size, I want to paint at 20% opacity, and I'm just going to go ahead and paint a line across like so, and then I'll paint another one that's a little bit whiter. And I'm just going to do that a few times so we get a nice highlight going through there. I might even do a little bit of that over here on this tip. And then down here we want to do the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and select this lighter gray color that we used for just the normal design. And I'm going to paint that over here because it'll appear lighter. So I'm going to go ahead and paint along this bottom edge a little bit and maybe a little bit right across through this middle area. Then let's go ahead and unselect out of this by switching back over to our marquee tool and clicking out of that to see how that looks. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see. Great. So now it looks a lot more like a reflective metal. Now we want a second latch over here on this side of our book. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and select all these layers, merge them together, so now that's all one layer. Then holding down Alt and using my grab and move tool, I can go ahead and drag over a layer, just like that, and we'll just move it over to here. Then using my arrow keys on my keyboard, I can nudge this into place until I like the placement of it. So I think right about there where I moved it is actually really good. Great. So next what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add in our gem. Now I think the quickest way to do this is to go ahead and grab the gem that we've already created, and we're going to change the color of this gold, and we'll just bring it in here and place it on our book. So I'm going to go ahead and find that folder. So here's my folder for that right there. And then I'm going to go ahead and merge my two layers that are making up this ring around it. So I'm going to right click, merge layers. Then using the Control U on my keyboard or Command U if you're on a Mac, I'm going to go ahead and bring out the saturation so that it becomes more of a gray color. And I might even darken it just a little bit. So I'm going to darken it to right about there. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab this folder, right click, and I'm going to merge group. So now that's all one layer. Now don't save this out, otherwise you're going to lose all those layers you had for this. but just for this purpose, I've merged it together so I can copy it. And then I'm going to go ahead and paste it in here. And using my transform tool, I can go ahead and shrink that down first off. So I want to shrink it down to about the size that I want it. So I don't want it too big, so about there should be a good size. Then I'm going to right click and come to distort. And then I can go ahead and distort this like I did with the top surface of my book. So I'm going to distort it to about there. Then I'll bring this corner up and this corner up a little bit, so it's sort of at that same angle as these lines. I might actually bring that down just a tiny bit. All right, great. And I think this is actually pulled over too much, so I'm going to pull these corners over because these lines need to match with these outside edges and these bottom lines need to match with these bottom edges. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit enter. Now this doesn't really look right because the gem is supposed to be three-dimensional, and so it looks like it's actually being flattened. So what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and warp our gem. So the way we'll do that is by coming back into here, we're going to hit Control Z to undo our move, and we might have to do that a couple of times. So that way our gem becomes its own thing once again. We have all of our layers over here in our layers panel, and we just want to find all the layers that have to do with our gem, and we're going to go ahead and merge them all together. So all 4 of these layers, we'll merge them. So now that is all one layer. Now we can go ahead and select that. Then we'll go ahead and come back into our book and we'll paste that in. And what we want to do now is we want to go ahead and first off shrink this down so it's about the size of the gem we already have there. So right about there should be good. Then we're going to right click and we're going to distort just like we did before, and we want to distort it to about the same angle that we have here on the top of our book. So right about there should do. Then we're going to right click again and then come to warp, and we want to warp this up a little bit so it has a little bit more of a bump so it looks more three-dimensional. We can pull down these bottoms so they stay in the correct position. So something like this should work. Keep working it until you get it looking the way you want. I think that about here should be good. So now I can go ahead and hit enter. Now it looks a little funny. I can use my erase tool to erase away this top area a little bit more just so it gets a better shape in there. But you should be getting the idea that by warping it, you can go ahead and get more of a three-dimensional look. Down here at the bottom, you'll notice that we see a little bit of the gem underneath it. So what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and zoom in there, and using my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and just paint in over that so we can no longer see that. All right, great. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. Perfect. Now I'm going to go ahead and merge all these layers together so that my gem is all on one layer. Then using my grab and move tool and the arrow keys on the keyboard, I can go ahead and nudge this over into the position I want it. So I'm going to move it to right about there. That brings us to the end of this lecture. So in this lecture, we went ahead and created these latches that go on the binding of our book, and then we created this gem. Well, we already created this gem previously, but then we took it and we applied it to our book and made it look a little bit more three-dimensional. In the next lecture, we're going to finish up with the details by adding in more of an edge on this book cover, maybe a few scratches and dings in here, and we'll also go ahead and add in a few bookmarks and papers and maybe even a ribbon bookmark hanging out of our book. Thanks for watching, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you in the next lecture. In this lecture, we're going to go ahead and add some finishing touches to our book to really make it pop. So first off, we're going to go ahead and add a little bit more of an edge to this gem piece, and the way we'll do that is we're going to add a new layer underneath it. Then we're going to go ahead and select the shape of this by holding down Control or Command and selecting the thumbnail shape. And then we're going to go ahead and select the gray that our piece is made out of. And then we're going to go ahead and grab an even darker version of that, so really close to our blacks. Then we'll go ahead and fill that in. Then using the arrow keys on our keyboard, we're going to go ahead and nudge that down to about there. Now, that's actually not looking dark enough for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control U or Command U, and I'm going to darken that to about there. Hit OK. Next, let's go ahead and paint an edge to the book cover, because right now it looks really thin because we can't really see an edge on it. So what I'll do is I'm going to select the color of my book, And then I'm going to go ahead and grab a little tiny bit of a lighter version of that color. So maybe to right there, hit OK. And I'm going to come down to my book cover layer, and I'm going to add a new layer above that. So that way, if I want to change anything about this, it doesn't affect my other layers. Then using my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and just hand paint in a ledge in there. So right across here, we can go ahead and hold down Shift and paint across so we get a nice straight line. But then we want to go in there by hand and sort of make that edge look a little bit more organic by hand painting it in. Then I'm going to go ahead and paint down here. Now at this point, I'm going to go ahead and bring down the lightness of this just a tiny bit, so maybe to there. And I'll go ahead and paint this edge. And we'll go ahead and paint this edge over here, so hold down Shift to get across there. And I'll go ahead and paint in a little bit more of an organic shape on there. Let's go ahead and zoom out, see how that looks. All right, I think that looks much better. Next, let's go ahead and add in some scratches onto our book surface because I think this will make it look much more interesting also. So I'm going to add a new layer above the layer we just created. And then I'm going to go ahead and select this dark red color down here on my book spine. And then on this top surface, I'll go ahead and just paint in some very simple lines for scratches. So that might be a little bit too dark. So I'm going to bring my brush opacity down to 50%. And then I'm going to go ahead and just paint in some lines. So they don't have to be perfect. Maybe even some spots in there. Then I'm going to go ahead and grab an even darker version of this, and in fact I'm going to come all the way down to black, and I'm going to add in a few little scratches on the spine of my book. And then what we want to do is we want to go in there with a lighter color, so let's select this color on our book spine. And then what we want to do is we just want to go ahead and paint right along the edge of these scratches. Go ahead and do the same thing right here. We want to do this for all of the scratches and spots that we added to our book cover. Now this is looking a little bit too light on our book spine, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my brush opacity down to 20%. That way it's a little bit lighter down here on the book spine. Alright, great. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. So now we have a little bit more texture in there. I think that looks really good. Next, let's go ahead and add a little bit of detail in between our pages. So what we want to do is add a few pages that look like they're sticking out of our book. So the way we'll do that is we're going to go in there with a brush tool, and I'm going to select this light color that we have here for our book, and on a new layer I'm going to go ahead and brush in sort of some pages sticking out of here. I want to make sure I'm at 100% opacity, and it's okay if the shape isn't perfect because we can always go back in there and erase. So I'm going to add one page sort of sticking out like this. Go ahead and fill that in. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a few more down here, so maybe one coming across like this. And another one sticking out right here. Then using my eraser, I'm going to go ahead and just erase away so that these become more of a hard-edged line. Same with this one. You can hold down Shift to click across there. That way we get a nice hard edge. Do the same thing here. Great. Then I'm going to go ahead and use my lasso tool for this part so I get a really nice straight line, and I'm going to cut across the top edges of these so that they're going at the same angle as my pages, then hit delete, and that's going to make it look like the pages are actually coming out of the book. And lastly, we'll do this one. Great, so now we have some pages sticking out of the book. Next, what we need to do is each one of these pages need a little bit more of some shadow. Now this one right here, I'm actually not really liking how far it's sticking out, so I'm going to go ahead and erase that just a little bit more until I get it to my liking. Alright, I think that works much better. So I'm going to add a layer underneath this layer, and then using the color black, because we want it to match this shadow right here from the top part of our book, we're going to go ahead and paint in some shapes that are very similar to these shapes right here. And we want to make sure that they're going downwards instead of coming out. And we want to make sure that each corner is touching the corner of our shadow. So our shadow needs to be touching the corner of this page and come down like this. And it's okay if your shape isn't perfect, because again, we can go back in there and erase it and use our lasso tool to get the shape looking the way we want it. Great. Now let's go ahead and use our erase tool, and we're going to go ahead and erase away the areas we don't want. And we'll go ahead and also reshape the shape of our shadows. So this guy might come over a little bit more like this. Perfect. Now let's go ahead and bring down the opacity on these to about, let's do 90%. And using my erase tool and coming to a hard-edged brush, or soft edge brush, sorry, I'm going to go ahead and erase away these bottom edges like I did up here. Now you want to be erasing at 20% opacity, so you're not completely erasing it away. And these ones might actually even be a little bit lighter, so we might even do 2 overpasses of erasing that. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. Those look a little bit too hard to me, so what I want to do is I'm going to bring down the opacity a tiny bit. I know they don't match the shadow up here, but I think they look better when they're lighter. Alright, great. Next, let's go ahead and add a ribbon bookmark sticking out of here. So I'm going to add a new layer above these layers, and then I'm going to go ahead and select a red color. So I'm going to come into sort of my reddish purplish colors, and I want to grab a darker red, but I want it to be pretty saturated still, so maybe somewhere in here. Hit OK. Then using my brush tool, I'm going to go ahead and paint in the shape of my ribbon bookmark. So maybe something like this should work. Great. Now I don't really like the placement, so I'm going to go ahead and use my grab and move tool and move this over. We can also go ahead and use the warp tool, so we'll use a transform, right click, come to warp, and we can go ahead and warp this a little bit more until it's sort of shaped a little bit more the way we want it. We'll go ahead and hit enter. And now we're going to go ahead and go in there with our erase tool, and we're just going to erase the shape out a little bit more. I want to make sure I'm on a hard-edged brush. We'll just erase this edge a little bit more. That was a little bit too much. And then I'm going to go ahead and erase this edge. And then using my lasso tool, I can go ahead and clip out more of a hard edge for this snake tongue. And I'll hit delete. Alright, perfect. So now we have the shape for our ribbon. Next, what we want to do is we want to cut off this top edge so that it's lined up with the angle of our pages. We'll hit delete. So now it looks like it's actually coming out of the book. Next, let's go ahead and add in some highlights in here to make this look more realistic. So I'm going to go ahead and select the shape of my layer. Now you could do this on a clipping layer mask to make it more accurate, but in this case, I think it'll be fine. So now what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and select my red color. I'm going to grab an even lighter version of this, quite a bit lighter actually, so about there should do. Then using my brush tool and bringing my brush opacity down to 10%, I'm going to go ahead and slowly layer in my highlights. So I want to add a little bit of some highlight or reflection down here at the bottom, because this is going to be a little bit glossy. That's why we're adding this in. Alright, now let's go ahead and unselect that, see how that looks. Great, I think that looks better. Then I'm going to go ahead and select this shape, and then I'm going to add a new layer underneath it. And I'm going to go ahead and select my original red color that I had for it, and I'm going to grab an even darker version of that, so about there should be good, maybe even darker. I'm going to go ahead and fill that shape in on this new layer, so it's underneath there, you can't see it yet, but if I nudge it down using my arrow keys, you'll see you can just barely see it now. I'm going to nudge it over to the left also, so that way it gives the ribbon a little bit more of an edge, and more of a three-dimensional look. Now I can go ahead and merge my two ribbon layers together, so this top layer and this bottom layer. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how our book looks all together. Great. Now the last thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and add a little bit of a shadow underneath this book so it stands out a little bit more. So what I want to do is I'm going to go ahead and select all the layers that are making up my book. Then I'm going to go ahead and hit Ctrl J to make a copy of all those layers, right click them and merge them together. So now we have a merged version, but we also still have all of our original layer pieces. So now with this, what we want to do is we want to go ahead and select the shape of it. Then we're going to go ahead and fill that in with a black on a new layer. So I'm going to go ahead and select the color black, fill that in. At this point, we can go ahead and delete this copied merged layer because we don't need it any longer. And then we're going to go ahead and drag this black colored in version all the way down to the bottom. So I'm going to bring it to there. So now you can't see it, but if we go ahead and use our nudge arrow keys, we can go ahead and nudge that out a little bit. And then I want to come up to filter and then come down to blur. And then we want to come down to Gaussian blur. Then we want to bring that down because that's blurred way too much. So maybe to about there, we'll hit OK. And we're going to nudge that down a little bit further so we can see a little bit more of that shadow. We also want to nudge it a little bit more over to the left side. Perfect. I think that looks pretty good. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and use our transform tool. And then we're going to right click and come to warp. And what I want to do is I want to warp this bottom area a little bit so that it's lining more up with this ribbon, but then we also want to pull this out so it comes back to its normal position. So about there should be good. We'll go ahead and hit enter. Then using my erase tool, and I want to make sure I'm on a soft edged brush, I'm going to erase some of these areas that shouldn't have shadows. So the only places that should have this shadow are the surfaces that are touching the surface it's sitting on. So up here, there shouldn't be a shadow because that's actually above the surface. Same with over here, this book spine. And we can bring down our opacity to 20% to slowly layer this in. So that way we get more of a soft edge on our erase. All right, great. Let's go ahead and zoom out and see how that looks. I think that looks much better. That brings us to the end of this lecture and the end of this project. So in this project, we went ahead and created this entire potion book that looks relatively realistic, at least for a game. And we also added in some realistic things such as these cast shadows, these papers sticking out, and we even added in some scratches on the top surface of our book just to give it some more texture. I really hope you enjoyed this project, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks for watching.